Lucia Rawlings had never expected to start over at 42. The ink had barely dried on her divorce papers when she stood in the dust of her newly purchased property on the outskirts of Burnett County, Texas, both facing a sun-baked lot and a house that hadn't seen love in years. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't even fully livable, but it was hers. After years of walking on eggshells in a marriage where silence did more damage than shouting, owning something she could shape with her own hands felt like breathing for the first time in over a decade. The place came cheap for a reason: it needed work. The fence was rotting, the backyard overgrown with prickly weeds, and the pool, once a selling point, had been filled in with sand and forgotten. Still, she saw potential. A quiet place. A project. A fortress. Not one meant to keep the world out, necessarily, but to remind herself she had control again. The first few months passed in a haze of dust, splinters, and sweat. Lucia hired local labor where she could, but for the most part, she took matters into her own hands. Mornings began with black coffee and a checklist. Evenings ended with bruised knees and chipped nails. She took particular care in rebuilding the backyard. It wasn't just landscaping, it was therapy. She tore down the warped fence and replaced it with a high, modern one made of composite panels, sturdy and quiet. No gaps, no visibility from the outside. It didn't take long before her neighbors started noticing. Not in the friendly, bring you a casserole way, more in the squint across the driveway, whisper behind the mailbox way. But Lucia didn't care. She wasn't here to charm a cul-de-sac or be anyone's friend. She was here to rebuild. The pool was the final piece. The old one had long been filled and left to decay, but beneath the dirt and debris, the concrete basin still held its shape. She had it excavated, resurfaced, tiled, and modernized: sleek black lines, clean decking, low-maintenance filtration. Every detail was intentional. A plunge pool, not oversized, framed by minimalist lights and heat-resistant tiles. It wasn't a space for entertaining. It was for peace, privacy. For once in her life, she had no one to explain her choices to. 2 weeks after completion, the pool was ready. That Friday, she invited her sister and one of her cousins, just a small group, people she trusted. They brought wine, sat in the twilight on pool loungers, and let the warm breeze and the hum of cicadas carry away old ghosts. For the first time in months, Lucia laughed without checking herself. She swam laps. She floated in silence. She let the stillness settle into her bones. That night, while locking the gate, she allowed herself the smallest smile. This was hers. She had built it from the ground up. The next day, she met Karen. It started simply enough. Lucia was out front trimming the edges of the new gravel path when a woman waved at her from the adjacent yard. Blonde, late 50s, maybe early 60s, but sharp, too put together for the midday heat. With a floral button-down tucked neatly into beige slacks and hair sprayed into immobility. She crossed the boundary between their properties as if the fence didn't exist and offered a wide, practiced smile. "You must be the new gal. Lucia, right? I'm Karen. Welcome to the neighborhood." Lucia wiped the sweat from her forehead with her forearm, nodding politely but not offering a handshake. Karen didn't seem bothered. "You've done a lot of work here. It's nice to see someone putting real effort into the place. The last owners let it go to hell." Lucia didn't reply. Karen followed her gaze toward the backyard, where a glint of water was visible between the panels of the tall privacy fence. "Pool looks beautiful," Karen said casually. "It used to be quite the gathering spot back in the day." "Oh, honey, we had the best 4th of July parties here. Before everything got fenced off, of course." Lucia offered a curt smile. "It's private now." Karen nodded, still smiling. Of course. Say my grandkids are visiting next week. 2 of them. Real well-behaved, sweet kids. They've been going crazy in this heat. I was thinking if you don't mind, maybe they could take a quick dip once or twice, just to cool down. I'd be with them, of course." Lucia paused, choosing her words carefully. "I'm afraid the pool isn't open for that kind of use." It's a private installation. Just for me. Karen blinked once. Then again. The smile never fully left her face, but a muscle in her jaw twitched ever so slightly. Oh sure, I didn't mean to impose. Just figured, well, you know how it used to be. But times change, don't they? They do, Lucia said, already turning back toward her tools. I hope you have a good afternoon. Karen left with a light wave, still smiling, but something in her tone had turned. Something brittle and thin, stretched like a too tight thread. That night, Lucia double-checked the locks on her side gate. The next few days passed without incident, but the air felt different. She noticed Karen more watering her front lawn too early in the morning, staring a second too long when Lucia drove past, always within sight. One evening, while grilling alone on the back deck, Lucia glanced up to see Karen standing just outside her own fence line, arms crossed, watching. When their eyes met, Karen tilted her head and walked off without a word. Then came the duck. Lucia woke early one morning, made her coffee, and stepped outside only to find a small, rubber duck floating in her pool. She stared at it for a long moment before fishing it out and setting it on the deck. It wasn't threatening. It wasn't overt, but it was wrong. Off. A message, and not a subtle one. Still, Lucia didn't call the police. Not yet. Nothing had technically happened. A duck in the pool, a conversation, a strange look individually, none of it was cause for alarm. But together they began to feel like the beginning of something. A pressure building, quiet and slow. That weekend, a man with a clipboard from the local development board showed up unannounced, saying someone had raised a complaint about water drainage from her pool filtration system possibly leaking into shared runoff. Lucia asked to see the complaint. The man simply said, "Anonymous resident concern," and recommended she have it inspected just in case. She didn't need to ask who made the call. That evening she had the lock on her side gate replaced. She called a local contractor she'd worked with before and booked him for a full surveillance system, motion lights, trail cameras, perimeter alerts. Not for evidence. Not for court. For clarity. She needed to know who was coming near her land and when. As she stood on her porch, watching the sun sink behind the trees, she felt it again, that tension in her shoulders, that invisible static in the air. It wasn't just about a pool. It wasn't even about boundaries, not really. It was about control, about someone else deciding what she was allowed to have, what parts of her life were theirs to access, to share, to repurpose. The realization settled in like cold water down her spine. She hadn't built this house just to live in it. She had built it to be safe. And now someone was already trying to take it back. Lucia didn't notice the gate was open at first. It had been an unusually hot Wednesday afternoon, the kind of heavy, suffocating heat that made the air shimmer above the pavement and slowed everything down to a crawl. She had been inside most of the day, working on a small design project for a client, some xeriscaping plan for a drought-prone property out in Marble Falls, and only stepped outside in the late afternoon to stretch and water the shade plants she had just repotted. That's when she saw it. The side gate, which she distinctly remembered locking the night before, was swinging slightly in the breeze, its latch bumping rhythmically against the post. She froze. The hairs on the back of her neck lifted, not out of fear, but from something deeper and instinctive unease, like realizing too late you've been watched. She walked to the gate slowly, checked the latch, then the ground below. There were no footprints, no disturbed soil, no obvious signs of forced entry. And yet, she was certain it had been closed, certain. She clicked it shut and locked it again, this time testing it twice. Then, as she turned back toward the house, her eyes landed on something out of place. A towel, light blue, draped lazily over one of the loungers by the pool. Not hers. She hadn't been out there since Sunday, and she certainly hadn't left a towel behind. She walked over and picked it up. It was damp, recently used, and had the faint, unmistakable scent of coconut sunscreen. The same kind she remembered Karen mentioning offhandedly during their brief, awkward chat. Her mind sharpened instantly. Someone had been on her property, in her pool, while she was home. The trespass wasn't just bold, it was casual, entitled, like it was their space, not hers. She stood frozen for several moments, staring at the towel in her hands before tossing it in a garbage bag and locking it in the garage. Then she went back inside, pulled out her notepad, and began writing everything down: dates, times, incidents, small details that might later blur or be dismissed. She didn't call anyone. Not yet. There were no witnesses, no damage, no confrontation. But something was shifting. This wasn't neighborhood friction. This was intrusion with history behind it, and she needed to be sure before she made it formal. The next day, Lucia noticed Karen sitting on her porch earlier than usual, a sun hat shading her face and a book open in her lap that she didn't seem to be reading. Lucia didn't make eye contact, but as she loaded bags of mulch into the trunk of her car, she caught Karen glancing up. Their eyes met briefly, just long enough for Lucia to recognize something behind the expression. Satisfaction, maybe. Or warning. Either way, it settled the matter. She drove straight to the sheriff's office. Inside, the deputy on duty, young, polite, maybe early 30s, listened as Lucia calmly explained what had happened. She didn't dramatize. She didn't speculate. She laid it out clean: open gate, unfamiliar towel, previous passive-aggressive encounters. When she mentioned Karen by name, the deputy raised an eyebrow and gave a low whistle. "Karen Whitmore?" he asked. Lucia nodded. "She's known," he said carefully. "Been in the neighborhood longer than most, sits on a few community boards. He had some disagreements with other folks in the past, but nothing criminal that ever stuck." Lucia didn't flinch. "I'm not asking for gossip. I just want it documented." The deputy nodded, scribbled something, and asked if she wanted to file an official report. She declined for now, but requested that the conversation be recorded internally. "I'll take care of security measures on my end," she said. "I just want a paper trail started." The deputy agreed, and before she left, he offered a polite word of advice. Sometimes people like her, they push just enough to get a reaction. Be careful not to give her one. Back home, Lucia spent the next 2 days supervising the installation of her new camera system. The crew moved quickly, setting up discrete motion sensors along the property's perimeter, infrared-equipped cameras covering both entrances and every angle of the backyard. She opted for a system with remote access and automated alerts, nothing that could be easily tampered with. The moment the system went live, she felt a little of the pressure lift off her chest. Not relief, not safety, just readiness. If Karen or anyone set foot on her property again, there would be no question, no more ambiguity, just evidence. That weekend, Lucia received her first anonymous letter. It was folded into thirds and stuffed into her mailbox, unsealed. No return address, no name, just a neatly printed message on standard printer paper. "People around here don't like walls. Don't make enemies you can't handle." She read it 3 times. There was no direct threat, no mention of names or specifics. But it didn't have to be explicit. It was a warning, and it was calculated. She took a photo of the letter, logged the time and date, then filed it away with the rest of her documentation. She didn't respond. She didn't mention it to anyone. But she did go to the local hardware store the next day and buy 2 additional padlocks and a set of floodlights. Sunday morning brought the first serious incident. Lucia had just stepped out of the shower, towel wrapped around her hair, when the motion alert buzzed on her phone. She opened the app and froze. There, in high-definition footage, was Karen, in her backyard, standing by the pool with her back to the camera, looking out over the water like it belonged to her. She wasn't alone. 2 teenage boys, maybe 16 or 17, were climbing out of the deep end, towels in hand, laughing and drying off. Karen didn't look rushed or guilty. She looked like she was enjoying a routine. Lucia didn't hesitate. She pulled on clothes and shoes, grabbed her phone, and stepped outside. Karen turned at the sound of the door, unfazed. "Morning," she said, as if this were a casual encounter. "The kids just needed to cool off for a bit. It's been brutal lately." Lucia stared, stunned at the brazenness. "You broke into my yard," she said flatly. "That gate was locked. And you are not allowed here." Karen's smile thinned. "You left it unlocked." "I checked. And the kids were overheating. I figured you'd be reasonable." Lucia walked forward, forcing herself to stay composed. "Get off my property. Now." One of the boys muttered something under his breath. Karen shot him a glance, then gathered her things. "This is how neighbors treat each other now," she muttered as she walked past. "What happened to community?" Lucia didn't respond. She waited until they were all gone before locking the gate behind them and double-checking the cameras. The footage was clear. Undeniable. She exported the file, backed it up twice, and uploaded a copy to cloud storage. The next morning, another letter arrived. This one was more aggressive. "You're not better than the rest of us. You bought into our neighborhood, not the other way around. You think hiding behind cameras makes you untouchable?" The threat was still veiled, still cautious, but more pointed. Lucia didn't wait this time. She took the footage and both letters and returned to the sheriff's office. A different deputy was on duty, older, lean, direct, and he took her seriously. After reviewing the footage, he shook his head. "This isn't just a neighbor dispute," he said. "This is unlawful entry and use of private property. You're well within your rights to press charges." Lucia asked what he recommended. He offered to send a formal warning to Karen, or they could escalate immediately. Lucia chose the warning, for now. "Let's give her one last chance to act like an adult," she said. But even as she drove home, she felt it in her gut. This wasn't over, and Karen wasn't going to take that letter as a warning. She was going to take it as a challenge. The warning letter had been delivered to Karen's mailbox less than 48 hours earlier, but the silence that followed didn't carry the weight of surrender or reflection. It was a quiet that felt held back, strained, too measured to be real. Lucia knew that kind of silence. It was the pause before a storm, not the calm that came after one. She spent the following day moving through her usual routine emails, small repairs, trimming the rosemary by the deck, but her attention never left the periphery. Every sound, every shadow near the fence line, made her shoulders tighten. The cameras picked up nothing unusual, and yet she felt watched in a way that had nothing to do with technology. It wasn't paranoia. It was a presence. 3 days later, it started again. It was early morning when she stepped outside to take the trash bins to the curb and found them already there. Not just rolled out, but perfectly aligned, spaced like someone had done it carefully, deliberately. At first, it almost felt like a favor until she opened the lid and saw the contents. The bags weren't hers. They were stuffed with soaked paper, takeout containers, a broken picture frame with a photo of a woman she didn't recognize. It wasn't threatening, not overtly, but it was personal. Someone had gone out of their way to insert a stranger's life into her space. She brought the bin back, opened the second one, and found more of the same, a pile of used pool noodles, brittle and sun-faded, with the name Whitmore. Scrawled in black marker on one of them, Karen's name. She stood for a long time in the driveway, staring down at the bins, wondering if this was a message, or a test, or both. She filed another report with the sheriff's office, speaking again to the older deputy, whose tone had shifted since their last meeting. "She's pushing you," he said, scratching at the corner of his notepad, "trying to provoke something, anything, so you'll snap first. Don't give her that. Let us build the case." Lucia didn't need to be told. She was already operating with calculated restraint. Every item was photographed. Every log was updated. She kept copies in multiple places, including a flash drive hidden inside her garage in a toolbox beneath a tray of drill bits. It wasn't fear driving her. It was preparation. That weekend, Karen made her next move not through action, but through others. It started subtly, neighbors waving a little less enthusiastically, conversations that used to pause when Lucia passed now stopped altogether. One woman, who had previously complimented her landscaping, crossed the street rather than walk past her gate. At first, she chalked it up to neighborhood politics, the ripple of tension that always followed conflict in close quarters. But by Monday, the situation had escalated. A notice appeared on her door, a printed letter on community association letterhead informing her that her fence was in violation of local aesthetic guidelines. It cited no ordinance, no code, just vague language about conformity to community expectations. The signature at the bottom was unfamiliar, but the language reeked of Karen. Lucia took the letter to the deputy, who skimmed it and said what she already suspected. It wasn't enforceable, not without a formal complaint, and even then, it would require review. But that wasn't the point. The goal wasn't legal action. It was erosion, the slow wearing down of boundaries, rights, certainty. Still, she responded formally, as always registered mail, time-stamped, with a copy sent to the municipal code office, just in case. She wasn't about to play defense without documentation. She wasn't about to become one of those stories people told in bitter hindsight, I should have done something earlier. No, she was already doing everything. By midweek, the harassment became physical, not violent but invasive. She returned home from a trip to the hardware store to find her front gate partially dismantled, not broken unscrewed. 2 bolts removed from the lower hinge, set neatly on the path as if someone wanted her to know they'd been there, that they could take the rest if they chose. She reviewed the footage. The cameras showed a figure in a wide hat, face obscured, approaching the gate just after 3 a.m., kneeling beside it, and working quietly for nearly 10 minutes. When she paused the video and brightened the contrast, the outline was unmistakable. Karen's body type, Karen's mannerisms. It was her. Lucia sent the footage to the sheriff's office immediately. This time, they scheduled a formal interview. We're reaching the point where this may cross into criminal mischief, the deputy explained. But unless she's caught in the act, or we find direct evidence tying her to the tools, it's going to be her word against a shadow on a video. Lucia didn't argue. She simply nodded and went home to reinforce the hinge plates with tamper-proof bolts. That night, her tires were slashed. She discovered it the next morning. Not all of them, just the rear left, cut at the base in a clean arc. It wasn't vandalism out of rage. It was calculated. Inconvenience. A statement. She stood there in the gravel, the heat already rising through the soles of her boots, and she let the silence stretch. Then she went inside, made a fresh pot of coffee, and called the sheriff. By now, the deputies knew her by voice. They arrived within an hour, took photos, collected the damaged tire, and promised a report. But they also reminded her there were no witnesses, no cameras on the street, no direct line between the act and Karen, not yet. The evidence kept piling up, but it was all circumstantial, and Karen knew that. Later that afternoon, a teenager came to her door. He was maybe 17, wiry, uncomfortable, holding a folded flyer in his hand. He introduced himself as Brandon, said he was part of a local initiative to bring back the spirit of the block, and handed her the paper. It was a community petition, half legitimate, half farce, calling for the restoration of shared amenities and neighborhood tradition. At the bottom were a handful of signatures, most of them scrawled or illegible. Karen's was printed boldly at the top. Lucia asked the boy if he knew what he was passing around. He shrugged, mumbled something about being paid $20 to go door to door, then walked off without looking back. Lucia didn't tear up the flyer. She kept it, scanned it, and added it to the archive. That night, as she was closing the blinds in the back room, she noticed something new, a small object in the corner of the patio, near the deck's edge. She stepped outside and approached it carefully. It was a child's pool toy, sun-bleached, slightly deflated, a plastic sea turtle with a faded red ribbon tied around its neck. The ribbon was knotted, tight. Not something a child would tie. She picked it up, turned it over, and found initials carved faintly into the plastic with what looked like a nail or a knife. KW, Karen's initials. Lucia didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She carried the toy inside, placed it in a Ziploc bag, labeled it with the date and time, and stored it with the rest. Then she poured herself a whiskey, sat on the porch, and stared out into the dark. The worst part wasn't the trespassing. It wasn't even the fear of confrontation. It was the knowledge that this wasn't aimless aggression. It was ritual. Symbolic. Karen wasn't just angry. She believed something had been taken from her. And Lucia was the vessel, the intruder, the thief in her eyes. That made her dangerous not because she was violent, but because she thought she was justified. The escalation had begun. And Lucia had no illusions about how far Karen might be willing to go. Lucia wasn't the kind of person who let herself spiral, but even she couldn't deny the toll the last 3 weeks had taken. It was the kind of stress that settled in strange places, in the stiffness of her neck before bed, in the way she started locking the bathroom door, even when home alone, or in the constant reevaluation of how to approach each day so it would cause the least friction. And the worst part wasn't what had already happened. It was knowing that Karen hadn't even come close to reaching her endgame. The small cruelties were stacking up, yes, but they felt rehearsed, practiced like Karen had done this before. Which meant there was a pattern, and patterns always ended in one of two places: someone gave up, or someone got hurt. Lucia didn't like either of those options. So when the letter from the county clerk arrived, a notification of a formal complaint filed against her for unauthorized structural modifications impacting historic neighborhood continuity, she wasn't surprised. It was nonsense, of course. The fence and the pool were both permitted, inspected, approved, and built on her property. But the language in the letter was sharp, bureaucratic, intentionally ambiguous. She read it 3 times before her stomach turned. The signature at the bottom was from a member of the Planning Advisory Council, a name she didn't recognize, but the kind of person someone like Karen would have drinks with after a town beautification committee meeting. The complaint triggered a formal review. A mandatory walkthrough of the property was scheduled for the following week. Lucia didn't panic, but she felt the edges closing in. These weren't just neighborhood games anymore. Karen was reaching into systems now, into paperwork and policy, and people who wore laminated badges and carried clipboards. This was strategy, and it was meant to disarm her. She didn't take the bait. Instead, she called a municipal property lawyer, a local, not someone with a fancy office, but a woman named Denise who had a reputation for being blunt and efficient. They met the next day. Lucia laid out everything: her records, permits, copies of the complaint, and most of all, her growing archive of incidents. Denise listened carefully, skimming the materials, nodding occasionally. When she was done, she looked up and said, "She's not trying to win. She's trying to exhaust you. That's what this is, pressure. And it's all legal, just enough." Lucia asked what her options were. Denise smiled grimly. "Document everything. Stay clean. Play by the book. You're already ahead of her, but she's betting you'll slip. That you'll eventually snap in a way she can use." That conversation grounded Lucia again. She didn't feel reassured, but she felt clear. This wasn't about a pool. It wasn't even about her, really. It was about someone who had grown used to claiming space that didn't belong to her and now couldn't stomach seeing someone else draw lines she couldn't cross. Karen was too old and too proud to start over, so instead she had decided that the world needed to go back to the way it was. And if that meant dragging Lucia through hell to get there, so be it. The day of the property review arrived under a thin layer of gray sky. The inspector was polite but stiff, clearly uncomfortable, caught in the middle of something he didn't want to touch. He moved through the checklist, glancing at the fence, nodding at the setback distances, measuring the height of the perimeter wall without enthusiasm. Lucia followed silently, Denise at her side. Everything was by the book. No violations. No notes. The man thanked them for their time and walked back to his car without making eye contact. Lucia and Denise stood in the driveway long after he left, listening to the wind pick up against the siding. Later that evening, Lucia received a message on her home intercom system. She rarely used it, had mostly forgotten it was connected to her front gate speaker, but Karen hadn't. Her voice crackled through the old system like something out of a dream. "I saw the inspector leave. Must be nice having the law in your pocket. But just so you know, people don't forget when you spit in their faces. Enjoy your little moat while you still have it." Lucia didn't respond. She didn't even go to the gate. She simply unplugged the intercom from the wall and set it in a drawer. The next morning, she found footprints by the pool again. Barefoot. Adult-sized. The motion lights had been disabled. Someone had clipped the wire. Not cleanly, but just enough to stop the circuit. She checked the cameras. The feed had been interrupted. Someone had jammed the signal for 22 minutes between 3 and 3:20 a.m. Whoever it was, they knew what they were doing. Karen didn't strike her as the technical type, but that didn't mean she hadn't recruited help. And that thought chilled Lucia more than anything else so far. This wasn't obsession anymore. It was turning into coordination, a campaign. Still, she didn't break routine. That afternoon, she walked to the edge of her property where the old oak trees bent toward Karen's lot and calmly began trimming branches. It wasn't for visibility. It wasn't for the cameras. It was for her. She needed to take space back, piece by piece. Reassert control. Not aggressively, just deliberately. By sunset, she had cleared the overhang and swept the path clean. As she locked the gate behind her, she glanced up at Karen's house and saw the curtain shift. Not enough to see her face. Just emotion. Just a reminder. Lucia stared back at the window until it stopped moving. Later that night, as she was closing down the house, her phone buzzed. A system notification. The driveway camera had picked up a figure walking past the front entrance, a dark shape, hooded, fast. Not stopping. Just passing by. Lucia reviewed the footage. It was grainy, distant, but familiar. It wasn't Karen. Too tall. Too lean. But it was connected. She didn't sleep that night. Not because she was scared, but because she knew she was crossing a line herself now, not toward aggression, but toward resolve. The fight wasn't a matter of if anymore. It was when. And she wouldn't be taken by surprise again. The first real shift happened not with a threat or a knock on the door, but with silence an entire day where nothing happened at all. No letters, no sightings, no lights tripped or wires cut, just stillness. Lucia felt the quiet wrap itself around her like a trap. The human instinct is to exhale when nothing happens, to let your shoulders drop and let your mind drift into the kind of peace you think you deserve. But peace isn't silence, and silence in this case wasn't absence. It was gathering. She felt it deep in her body, like an animal before a storm, the unnatural pause and pressure before something breaks. She didn't relax. She spent that day checking and double-checking locks, organizing her documentation, updating Denise with a timeline that had grown to 34 discrete incidents. When she went to bed, she didn't sleep. She lay still, fully dressed, a flashlight and her phone beside her on the nightstand. The next morning shattered the silence. It began with 3 loud knocks on the door, rapid, deliberate, not tentative. She opened it to find a man standing there in a contractor's vest, clipboard in hand, badge clipped to his collar. He introduced himself as a representative from the Water Services Department, claimed they had received multiple complaints about her irrigation runoff and needed to perform a site check for contamination risks. Lucia stared at him for several seconds before speaking. "Who filed the complaint?" she asked. The man shrugged. "Anonymous. But it came through our digital platform, which means we're obligated to follow up." She didn't argue. Instead, she stepped outside and walked into the side of the house, showing him the system fully contained, modern, within code. He checked a few valves, took a couple of photos, then nodded and left. No citations, no issues. But that wasn't the point. She wasn't supposed to be fined. She was supposed to be disrupted, pulled out of her rhythm. Karen was done with theatrics. Now she was playing a slow, grinding game, one complaint, one visit, one legal pebble at a time. Later that afternoon, Lucia received a call from Denise. "I just got word that Karen filed a private nuisance suit against you," she said. "Claims your security lights violate her right to peaceful enjoyment of her property and are being used to harass her." Lucia let out a breath but didn't respond. "It won't hold," Denise continued, "but it will cost time. Appearances, statements, counterfilings. She's using the legal system like a stick, just swinging until something lands." Lucia thanked her and hung up, then walked into her yard and stared at the lights motion-sensitive LED easy-angled downward, compliant with code, dimmer than a porch light. It wasn't about brightness. It was about drawing a line between space she controlled and space Karen couldn't touch. The lights stayed. The next incident was physical. It happened 2 days later, just after sunset, as Lucia returned from the store. She had parked halfway up the driveway when she noticed the rear gate swinging open. She froze. The wind wasn't strong enough to move it, and she had locked it earlier that afternoon. She stepped out of the car slowly, scanning the perimeter. The yard was empty, silent, but the gate creaked faintly in the wind, swinging just enough to whisper that someone had passed through. She walked the line of the fence, checked the lock. It hadn't been forced. The screws had been loosened from the inside, not broken, just turned enough to let someone pass without tools. She didn't call the sheriff. She went inside, pulled her copy of the footage, and fast-forwarded through the last 3 hours. At 7:42 p.m., the image glitched. A brief flicker. Then static. Then nothing for 10 minutes. When the feed returned, the gate was open. Lucia sent the footage to Denise, who forwarded it to the deputies. "They're going to have to start taking this seriously," Denise wrote. "We're bordering on criminal trespass with technological interference. I'll prepare a demand letter. No more warnings." That night, Lucia received another message through her intercom, shorter this time, and more direct. "I gave you a chance to be part of this. It shows a side. Don't act surprised by what comes next." The voice was clipped, empty of the false sweetness Karen once used. It wasn't performative anymore. It was ritual. The voice of someone whose version of the world had narrowed down to one mission: reassert control. The escalation came quickly. The next morning, Lucia woke to find her garden destroyed. Not trampled or burned, but stripped. Every planter box had been emptied, the soil dumped onto the pavement, the plants missing entirely. The irrigation lines were severed and left coiled on the concrete like snakes. It was done with precision and patience, not vandalism but dismantling. She didn't cry. She didn't rage. She called Denise, documented everything, filed a report. The deputies took it more seriously now. They dispatched a patrol officer to sit outside her home that night, unofficially. "It won't make it to paper," the deputy said, "but we're watching now. We know what this is." Karen knew too, and she didn't care. The following day brought the breaking point. Lucia was working from her back patio, laptop open, headphones in, when she saw the reflection of movement behind her in the screen. She turned slowly, expecting an animal, maybe a stray cat. Instead, she saw Karen standing just outside the pool gate. Not on her property, not crossing the line, but close enough to breathe on it. Her eyes were fixed on Lucia. She said nothing. Didn't blink. Didn't smile. Just stared, motionless. Lucia stood up and stepped forward. "You need to leave," she said calmly. Karen didn't move, just stood there, her arms at her sides, eyes burning with something ancient and brittle. "This was ours," she whispered. "Before you came here. This was where we lived, where we raised our kids, where we celebrated. You fenced it off, turned it into something cold." Lucia said nothing. Karen's voice rose. "You don't belong here. None of you do." You just showed up and erased everything. And now you act like we're the intruders. Lucia moved toward the gate, but Karen stepped back, still not crossing the line. It won't last, she said softly. You're not strong enough to hold it forever. Then she turned and walked away, slowly, calmly, as if she had delivered a eulogy. That night, Lucia fortified the gate with a second lock. She reviewed all camera feeds. She uploaded new backups. She installed a pressure sensor at the base of the rear fence and set the alerts to instant ping. She was done reacting. Now she was preparing, not for an ambush, not for a confrontation, for something worse. Because when someone like Karen runs out of ways to scare you, there's only one thing left for them to do. Act. It happened on a Wednesday just past 9 in the evening, long after the sky had faded into a flat charcoal and the cicadas had given up their screaming for the day. Lucia had been on edge all week, but that night the tension in her body had shifted. It wasn't the kind of nervous alertness that made you flinch at shadows or obsess over every creak in the floorboards. It was the deep, low hum of inevitability, the sense that something had already been set in motion and nothing she did now would stop it, only define how she responded when it arrived. She had eaten a light dinner, checked the locks like she always did, poured herself half a glass of wine she wouldn't finish, and settled into the living room to read. Her phone was charging beside her. The camera feeds were active, silent, untouched. For the first time in weeks, everything looked still. She didn't hear the gate open. What reached her first was the quiet click of the rear patio latch, followed by a sound she couldn't identify at first, a soft, unhurried tread on the deck boards, far too deliberate to be an animal. Lucia rose without panic, set the book down with precision, and walked silently to the hallway table where she kept her keys and phone. She didn't grab the phone. She grabbed the flashlight. Then she turned toward the sliding glass door. Karen was already standing there. She stood on the other side of the glass, staring in without blinking, arms loose at her sides, her hair a little undone, and as if she had run her hands through it one too many times. The porch light illuminated her face in profile, and something about her expression was worse than rage. It was vacant, resolved. Her right hand was inside the oversized bag slung across her body, unmoving like it had been there for some time. Lucia didn't move. She stood facing the door, their gazes locked through the glass, not more than 4 feet apart. Her hand tightened slightly around the flashlight, but she didn't raise it. She didn't speak. Karen was the one who broke the stillness. Her hand moved slowly, and when it emerged from the bag, she was holding a handgun. Small, black, worn at the grip. Her posture didn't change. She didn't aim. She simply let her hand hang at her side, gun in it like it was a purse or a phone. Her eyes flicked downward, as if to make sure Lucia saw it, then back up again. Lucia didn't flinch. She had expected many things, but not this naked, awful attempt at final control. She could almost hear Karen's thoughts like static. Look at what you made me become. Karen finally spoke, her voice muffled slightly by the glass, but clear enough. You ruined everything. You didn't have to. You could have shared. You could have respected what was here before you. Lucia didn't answer. She stood still, watching the weapon more than the face, calculating the angle, the distance, the glass between them. Karen's grip was tight but trembling. Her breathing had quickened. There was no plan in her posture, no tactical intent, just emotion, rising and unstable. Lucia spoke then, her voice calm, low. Put it down, Karen. You don't want this. Karen's lip curled, not in anger but in anguish. You think this is about you? She whispered, stepping closer so her breath fogged the glass. You think this is personal? This was a place people came to feel whole. And you fenced it off. You gutted it and tiled it and turned it into your personal fortress. You tore the memory right out of the ground. Her hand rose slightly, not aiming but drifting up. Lucia didn't hesitate. She stepped back one pace and pressed the panic button on her key fob. A deafening burst rang out from every edge of the property, the sirens installed discreetly with the alarm system Denise had quietly suggested weeks ago. Karen flinched hard, staggered a step backward, and in that moment the gun clattered to the wooden deck as she jerked her hand away from it instinctively. She looked down, stunned, her composure cracking like dried plaster. The porch lights surged brighter in response to the alarm's trigger, washing her in a harsh white glow that stripped her of shadow and ambiguity. For the first time, she looked small, not weak but finished. Lucia opened the door. She didn't step outside. She stood in the frame and said clearly, "Leave now before the deputies get here, or don't. But you don't get to talk about what this place was. You gave it up the moment you decided it should belong to you forever." Karen didn't move. Then, as if something inside her had come unstuck, she turned slowly, picked up her bag, leaving the weapon behind, and walked down the deck stairs, across the yard, and out through the gate. By the time the sheriff's car arrived 8 minutes later, she was already gone. Lucia handed over the gun, the footage, the audio from the intercom days prior, and the file containing the full incident log. There were no questions. The officers were silent, professional, no longer skeptical. This was no longer a neighbor dispute. This was attempted intimidation with a deadly weapon. They opened a case. They said words like restraining order, unlawful entry, and mental health evaluation. Lucia didn't ask for details. She just answered their questions and watched them leave with the gun in an evidence bag. Later, she stood at the edge of the deck, her hands resting on the rail, eyes scanning the pool. Everything looked normal. Everything looked exactly the same as it had that morning. But the air felt different, not lighter, not better, just real. The illusion of neighborliness had been shattered for good. There was no fence high enough to hide what had happened here. There was no rewind button for nights like this. And now, for the first time, Lucia understood what she'd been fighting for all along. It wasn't about safety. It wasn't even about peace. It was about the right to draw a boundary and to defend it without asking for permission. 3 weeks passed before Lucia saw Karen again. It wasn't in person. It was through a single photo printed in black and white, attached to the final report delivered by the sheriff's office. Karen Whitmore, age 61, was officially charged with unlawful trespass, attempted intimidation with a firearm, and possession of an unregistered weapon. The investigation confirmed that the gun hadn't been loaded, a detail that didn't lessen the seriousness of her actions but painted a clearer picture of her state of mind. Karen had turned herself in 2 days after the incident, arriving at the sheriff's office with her attorney and 2 bags of medication, quietly invoking a medical review of her mental health status. She had since been placed under court-supervised treatment at a psychiatric care facility in Austin, where she would remain for no less than 6 months, pending further evaluation. There would be no trial. The charges would be suspended so long as she completed her program and agreed never to return to the property or contact Lucia again, under threat of felony prosecution. Lucia signed the agreement without hesitation. Not out of fear, not to avoid confrontation, but because she was ready to close the door. This wasn't about vengeance or retribution. It was about finality. She had done what needed to be done. She had protected what was hers without breaking the law, without retaliating with the same cruelty that had been thrown at her. That mattered. It mattered more than she realized. The community shifted afterward, but not in the way some might expect. There were no apologies. No one knocked on her door to say they'd been wrong. The neighbors who had whispered or looked away continued doing so, but with a new edge, quiet respect, cautious distance. A few even started trimming their hedges more often, repairing broken fences, repainting shutters. The unspoken message was clear: she wasn't going anywhere. And she wasn't afraid to protect what was hers. She filed the footage, documents, and incident logs into a locked drawer in her office, labeled them, and tucked the key inside a small box she kept in her safe next to her passport, property deed, and the divorce settlement she'd once thought she'd never escape. These papers, all of them, told the story of who she had become, not a woman who sought conflict, but one who could withstand it. Not someone who welcomed isolation, but someone who chose solitude when the alternative was invasion. Her house no longer felt like a fortress under siege. It felt like a home reclaimed. The pool remained untouched for a while. She drained it, scrubbed every tile, resealed the deck. It wasn't about damage, it was about cleansing. Not just physically, but symbolically. When she finally refilled it, she did so alone. No music, no drinks, no guests, just the sound of the water rising, inch by inch, erasing every trace of what had been taken from her. She didn't rush back into using it. She let the silence settle first. Let the space breathe again. Only then, weeks later, did she walk out onto the deck one morning, step into the water, and swim a single lap, slow and steady, under the rising sun. Denise remained in contact, mostly to tie up loose ends, civil filings, official property line confirmations, records updates with the county. With her help, Lucia installed new signage and updated her title with an additional clause, non-public recreational use only. Just a legal formality, but it mattered. On paper, there would never again be any confusion about who the pool belonged to. By summer's end, Lucia had completed the final phase of her yard project. Not an expansion, not a redesign. A wall, clean, simple, matching the existing structure, but tall enough to give her total privacy. Not a fortress. A statement. The last brick was laid the same day the last surveillance sign was removed. She no longer needed warnings. She had already made herself understood. In the final days of August, Lucia hosted her sister and niece for a quiet evening, grilled food, soft music, no mention of the past. They swam, talked, watched the sky turn violet. Her niece, a teenager too perceptive for her age, floated near the edge of the pool and said, without preamble, "I think people like her believe they're the only ones who remember things." Lucia had just nodded. She didn't need to say more. The truth had already been lived. That night, when everyone had gone, she sat on the deck alone and looked out over the dark water. No ghosts, no threats, just the gentle rhythm of the pool filter and the soft rustle of leaves against the fence. This was what she had built, not just the structure, the space, the silence, the certainty, and no one would ever take that from her again.